We are here today for a most unique occurrence. We have a very special guest who has traveled not merely from another city, not merely from another continent, but from another time altogether. He did not arrive in our fair city by the prosaic means of a ship, or a locomotive, or a jet. No! One might say he arrived by astral plane. That's right. His last visit to these fair shores occurred in the year of our Lord, 1867. And now, he has returned, lured out of ethereal retirement as the last days of this century draw nigh, by the rare and privileged opportunity to perform, pro bono, mind you, in our beloved India Hall. So, will you please give a warm welcome, a warm Hollywood Temple welcome, to a man whom we have great expectations of, the man who taught Oliver the Twist, a man who was credited with single-handedly reviving the celebration of Christmas, the very spirit of Christmas past himself, the one, the only, Charles Dickens!
Merry Christmas! Merry Christmas! Merry Christmas to Hollywood Temple. Merry Christmas. It is a great delight to be back here again in these United States, and on these holy grounds, to raise, as it were, the ghost of an idea that will haunt us all, will lift our spirits into the very heart of the mystery of Christmas. And so, let us begin. Marley was dead, to begin with. There is no doubt whatever about that. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman, the clerk, the undertaker, and the chief mourner. Scrooge signed it, and Scrooge's name was good for anything he chose to put his hand to. Marley was as dead as a doornail. Mind, I don't mean to say that I know of my own direct knowledge what there is particularly dead about a doornail. I might have been inclined myself to regard a coffin nail as the deadest piece of ironmongery in the trade. But the wisdom of our ancestors is in the expression, and my unhallowed hands shall not disturb it, or the country is done for. So, you will therefore permit me to repeat emphatically that Marley was as dead as a doornail. Scrooge knew he was dead. Of course he did. How could it be otherwise? Scrooge and Marley were partners for I don't know how many years. Scrooge never painted out old Marley's name. There it stood for years afterwards above the warehouse door, Scrooge and Marley. Sometimes people new to the business called Scrooge Scrooge, and sometimes Marley, but he answered to both names. It was all the same to him. Oh, but he was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone, Scrooge. A squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner, hard and sharp as flint, from which no steel had ever struck out generous fire, secret, self-contained, and solitary as an oyster. The cold within him froze his old features, nipped his pointed nose, made his eyes red, his thin lips blue, and spoke out shrewdly in his grating voice. He carried his own low temperature always about with him. He iced his office in the dog days of summer, and he didn't thaw it 1 degree at Christmas. External heat and cold had little influence on Scrooge. No warmth could warm, no wintry weather chill him, no wind that blew was bitterer than he, no pelting rain less open to entreaty. Nobody ever stopped him on the streets to say with gladsome looks, "My dear Scrooge, how are you? When will you come to see me?" No children asked him what it was o'clock. No beggars implored him to bestow a trifle. No man or woman ever once in all his life ever once inquired the way to such and such a place of Scrooge. Even the blind men's dogs appeared to know him. And when they saw him coming on, would tug their owners into doorways and up courts. But what did Scrooge care? It was the very thing he liked. To edge his way along the crowded paths of life, warning all human sympathy to keep its distance. Once upon a time, of all good days in the year, on Christmas Eve, old Scrooge sat busy in his counting house. It was cold, bleak, biting weather, foggy withal, and he could hear the people in the court go wheezing up and down, beating their hands upon their breasts and stamping their feet on the pavement stones to warm them. The city clocks had only just gone 3, but it was already very dark. The fog came pouring in at every chink and keyhole, and was so dense without that although the court was of the narrowest, the houses opposite were mere phantoms. The door of Scrooge's counting house was open, that he might keep his eye upon his clerk, who, in a dismal little cell beyond, a sort of tank, was copying letters. Scrooge had a very small fire, but the clerk's fire was so very much smaller that it looked like one coal. But he couldn't replenish it, for Scrooge kept the coal box in his own room. And so soon as the clerk came in with the shovel, the master predicted that it would be necessary for them to part. Whereupon the clerk put on his white comforter and tried to warm himself at the candle, in which effort, not being a man of strong imagination, he failed. "A Merry Christmas, Uncle!" It was the voice of Scrooge's nephew, who came upon him so quickly that this was the first intimation he had of his approach. He'd so heated himself with rapid walking in the fog and frost, this nephew of Scrooge's, that he was all in a glow. His face was ruddy and handsome, and his eyes sparkled. "A Merry Christmas, Uncle! God save you!" "Bah! Humbug! Christmas? A humbug? You don't mean that, Uncle, I'm sure." "I do. Merry Christmas." "Don't be cross, Uncle. What else can I be when I live in such a world of fools as this? Merry Christmas. What's Christmas time to you but a time for paying bills without money? A time for finding yourself a year older and not an hour richer? If I could work my will, every idiot who goes about with a Merry Christmas on his lips should be boiled in his own pudding and buried with a stake of holly through his heart. He should. Uncle, nephew, keep Christmas in your own way. Let me keep it in mine. Keep it? But you don't keep it. Let me leave it alone then. Much good may it do you. Much good it has ever done. There are many things from which I might have derived good, by which I have not profited, I dare say. Christmas among the rest. But I'm sure I've always thought of Christmas time, when it has come round, apart from the veneration due to its sacred name and origin. If anything belonging to it can be considered, apart from that, as a good time, a kind, charitable, pleasant time. The only time I know of in the long calendar of the year when men and women seem by one consent to open their shut-up hearts freely and to look upon their fellow beings as really fellow passengers to the grave and not another race of creatures bound on other errands. And therefore, though it's never put a scrap of gold or silver in my pocket, I believe it has done me good and will do me good, and I say, God bless it! The clerk in the tank involuntarily applauded. Becoming immediately sensible of the impropriety, he hastily poked the fire and extinguished the last frail spark forever. Let me hear another sound from you, and you'll keep your Christmas by losing your situation. You are quite a powerful speaker, sir. I wonder you don't go into Parliament. Uncle, come dine with us tomorrow. Scrooge said that he would see him. Indeed, he did. He went the whole length of that expression and said that he would see him in that extremity first. But why? Why? Good afternoon. I want nothing from you. I ask nothing of you. Why cannot we be friends? Good afternoon. I'm very sorry, with all my heart, to find you so resolute. But I shall keep my Christmas humor to the last. So, a Merry Christmas, Uncle. Good afternoon. And a Happy New Year. Good afternoon. Scrooge's nephew left without an angry word, notwithstanding, and stopped to bestow the greetings of the season on the clerk, who, cold as he was warmer than Scrooge, for he returned them heartily. There's another fellow, my clerk, with 15 shillings a week and a wife and family, talking about a Merry Christmas. I'll retire to Bedlam. The clerk, letting Scrooge's nephew out, had let 2 other people in. They were portly gentlemen, pleasant to behold, and they stood now in Scrooge's office with their hats off. They had books and papers in their hands and bowed to him. Scrooge and Marley's, I believe. Have I the pleasure of addressing Mr. Scrooge or Mr. Marley? Mr. Marley has been dead these 7 years. He died 7 years ago this very night. We are sure his liberality is well represented in his surviving partner. At this festive time of year, Mr. Scrooge, it is more than usually desirable that we should make some slight provision for the poor and destitute who suffer greatly at the present time. Many thousands are in want of common comforts. Hundreds of thousands are in want of common necessaries. Are there no prisons? Plenty of prisons. And the union workhouses, they are still in operation? They are. Still, I wish I could say they were not. The treadmill and the poor law are in full vigor, then? Both very busy, sir. Oh, I was afraid, from what you said at first, that something had occurred to stop them in their useful course. I'm very glad to hear it. Under the impression that they scarcely furnish Christian cheer of body or mind to the multitude, a few of us are endeavoring to raise a fund to buy the poor some meat and drink and means of warmth. We choose this time because it is a time of all others when want is keenly felt and abundance rejoices. What shall I put you down for? Nothing. You wish to be anonymous. I wish to be left alone. Since you ask me what I wish, gentlemen, that is my answer. I don't make myself merry at Christmas, and I can't afford to make idle people merry. I hope to support the establishments I have mentioned. They cost enough. And those who are badly off must go there. Many can't go there, and many would rather die. If they had rather die, then let them do it and decrease the surplus population. Good afternoon, gentlemen. Seeing clearly that it would be useless to pursue their point, the gentlemen withdrew. Scrooge resumed his labors with an improved opinion of himself and in a more facetious temper than was usual with him. Meanwhile, the fog and darkness thickened so that people ran about with flaring links, proffering their services to go before horses in carriages and conduct them on their way. The ancient tower of a church, whose gruff old bell was always peeping slyly down at Scrooge out of a Gothic window in the wall, became invisible in the fog, and struck the hours and the quarters in the clouds with tremulous vibrations afterwards, as if its teeth were chattering in its frozen head up there. The cold became intense. In the main street, at the corner of the court, some labourers were repairing the gas pipes and had lighted a great fire in a brazier, round which a party of ragged men and boys were gathered, warming their hands and winking their eyes before the blaze in rapture. Foggier yet, and colder. Piercing, searching, biting cold. The owner of one scant young nose, gnawed and mumbled by the hungry cold as bones are gnawed by dogs, stooped down at Scrooge's keyhole to regale him with a Christmas carol. But at the first sound of "God rest ye merry gentlemen, let nothing you dismay," Scrooge seized the ruler with such energy of action that the singer fled in terror, leaving the keyhole to the fog and even more congenial frost. At length the hour of shutting up the counting house arrived. With an ill will, Scrooge dismounted from his stool and tacitly admitted the fact to the expectant clerk in the tank, who instantly snuffed his candle out and put on his hat. "You'll want all day tomorrow, I suppose." "If quite convenient, sir." "It's not convenient, and it's not fair. If I was to stop half a crown for it, you'd think yourself ill-used, I'll be bound. And yet, you don't think me ill-used when I pay a day's wages for no work." "It's only once a year, sir." "A poor excuse for picking a man's pocket every 25th of December. But I suppose you must have the whole day. Be here all the earlier next morning." The clerk promised that he would, and wrapping himself in his white comforter, the office was closed in a twinkling. Scrooge, buttoning his greatcoat to his chin, walked out with a growl. The clerk, with the long ends of his white comforter dangling below his waist, for he boasted no greatcoat, went down a slide on Cornwall at the end of a lane of boys 20 times in honor of its being Christmas Eve, and then ran home to Camden Town as hard as he could pelt to play at Blindman's Bluff. Scrooge took his usual melancholy dinner in his usual melancholy tavern, and having read all the newspapers and beguiled the rest of the evening with his banker's book, went home to bed. He lived in chambers that had once belonged to his deceased partner. They were a gloomy suite of rooms in a lowering pile of building up a yard. The yard was so dark that even Scrooge, who knew its every stone, was fain to grope with his hands. The fog and frost so hung about the black old gateway of the house that it seemed as if the genius of the weather sat in mournful meditation on the threshold. Now, it is a fact that there was nothing at all particular about the knocker on the door except that it was very large. It is also a fact that Scrooge had seen it night and morning during the whole period of his residence in that place. Also that Scrooge had as little of what is called fancy about him as any man in the city of London. Let it also be borne in mind that Scrooge had not bestowed one thought on Marley since his last mention of his 7 years dead partner that afternoon. And then, let any man explain to me, if he can, how it happened that Scrooge, having his key in the lock of the door, saw in the knocker, without its undergoing any intermediate process of change, not a knocker, but Marley's face. Marley's face. It was not in impenetrable shadow as the other objects in the yard were, but had a dismal light about it, like a bad lobster in a dark cellar. It was not angry or ferocious, but looked at Scrooge as Marley used to look, with ghostly spectacles turned up on its ghostly forehead. The hair was curiously stirred, as if by breath or hot air, and though the eyes were wide open, they were perfectly motionless. As Scrooge stared fixedly at this phenomenon, it was a knocker again. To say that he was not startled, or that his blood was not conscious of a terrible sensation to which it had been a stranger from infancy, would be untrue. However, he seized the key he had relinquished, turned it sturdily, and walked in. He did pause with a moment's irresolution before he shut the door, and he did look cautiously behind it first, as if he half expected to be terrified with the sight of Marley's pigtail sticking out into the hall. But there was nothing on the back of the door except the screws and nuts that held the knocker on. So he said, "Poof, poof," and closed the door with a bang. The sound resounded through the house like thunder. Every room above and every cask in the wine merchant's cellars below appeared to have a separate peal of echoes of its own. Scrooge was not a man to be frightened by echoes. He closed the door. Trimming his candle, went across the hall, slowly too, for it was very dark. But what did Scrooge care? Darkness was cheap, and Scrooge liked it. But before he shut his heavy door, he went all through his rooms to see that all was right. He had just enough recollection of the face to desire to do that. Sitting room, bedroom, lumber room, all as they should be. Nobody under the table, nobody under the sofa. Small fire in the grate, spoon and basin ready, little saucepan of gruel, for Scrooge had a cold in his head, upon the hob. Nobody under the bed. Nobody in the closet. Nobody in his dressing gown, which was hanging up in a suspicious attitude against the wall. Quite satisfied, he closed his door and locked himself in. Double locked himself in, which was not his custom. Thus secured against surprise, he sat down before the fire to take his gruel. It was a very low fire indeed. Nothing on such a bitter night. He was obliged to sit close to it and brood over it before he could extract the least sensation of warmth from such a handful of fuel. The fireplace was an old one, built by some Dutch merchant long ago, and paved all round with quaint Dutch tiles designed to illustrate the scriptures. But now, if each smooth tile had been a blank at first, with the power to shape some picture from the disjointed fragments of his thoughts, there was a copy of old Marley's head on every one. Humbug! Scrooge, as he head back in his chair, his glance happened to rest upon a bell. A disused bell that communicated for some purpose long forgotten with the chamber in the highest story of the building. It was with great astonishment and a strange, inexplicable dread that as he looked, he saw this bell begin to swing. It swung so softly at the outset that it scarcely made a sound. But soon it rang out loudly, and so did every bell in the house. Clang-a-lang, clang-a-lang, clang-a-lang. This might have lasted half a minute or a minute, but it seemed an hour. The bells ceased as they had begun together. They were succeeded by a clanking noise deep down below, as if someone were dragging a heavy chain over the casks in the wine merchant's cellar. Scrooge then remembered to have heard that ghosts in haunted houses were described as dragging chains. He heard the cellar door fly open with a booming sound, and then he heard the noise much louder on the floors below, and then coming up the stairs, and then coming straight toward his door. It's humbug still. I won't believe it. His colour changed, though, when without a pause it came on through the heavy door and passed into the room before his eyes. Upon its coming in, the dying flame leapt up as though it cried, "I know him, Marley's ghost!" The same face. The very same. Marley, in his pigtail, usual waistcoat, tights and boots, the tassels on the boots bristling like his pigtail, and the hair upon his head. The chain he drew was clasped about his middle and wound around him like a tail, and it was made, for Scrooge observed it closely, of cash boxes, padlocks, ledgers, deeds, and heavy purses wrought in steel. His body was transparent, so that Scrooge, observing him and looking through his waistcoat, could see the 2 buttons on his coat behind. Scrooge had often heard it said that Marley had no bowels, but he never believed it until now. No, nor did he believe it even now. Though he looked the phantom through and through, and marked the very texture of the folded kerchief bound about its head and chin, he was still incredulous, and fought against his senses. How now? What do you want with me? March. Marley's voice, no doubt about it. Who are you? Ask me who I was. Who were you then? You're particular for a shade. He was going to say to a shade, but substituted this as being more appropriate. Who were you then? In life, I was your partner, Jacob Marley. Can you sit down? I can. Do it then. Scrooge asked the question because he didn't know whether a ghost so transparent might find himself in a condition to take a chair. But the ghost sat down on the opposite side of the fireplace as if he were quite used to it. You don't believe in me? I don't. What evidence would you have of my reality beyond that of your senses? I don't know. Why do you doubt your senses? Because a little thing affects them. A slight disorder of the stomach makes them cheats. You might be an undigested bit of beef, a blot of mustard, a fragment of an underdone potato. There's more of gravy than of grave about you, whatever you are. It is an appalling cry from the ghost. Scrooge held on tight to his chair to save himself from falling into a swoon. But how much greater was his horror when the phantom, taking off the bandage round his head and jaw, as if it were too warm to wear indoors, his lower jaw dropped down upon his breast. Scrooge fell upon his knees and clasped his hands before his face. Mercy, dreadful apparition, why do you trouble me? Man of the worldly mind, do you believe in me or not? I do. I must. But tell me, why do spirits walk the night, and why do they come to me? It is required of every man that the spirit within him should walk abroad among his fellow men, and travel far and wide. And if that spirit goes not forth in life, it is condemned to do so after death. It is doomed to wander through the world. Oh, woe is me, and witness what it cannot share, but might have shared on earth and turned to happiness. You are fettered. Tell me why. I wear the chain I forged in life. I made it, link by link, and yard by yard. I girded it on of my own free will, and of my own free will I wore it. Is its pattern strange to you? Or would you know the weight and length of the strong coil you bear yourself? It was full as heavy and as long as this 7 Christmas Eves ago. You have laboured on it since. It is a ponderous chain. Scrooge glanced about him nervously, half in the expectation of finding himself surrounded by 50 or 60 fathoms of iron cable, but he could see nothing. Jacob! Oh, Jacob Marley! Speak comfort to me, Jacob. I have none to give. It comes from other regions, Ebenezer Scrooge, and is conveyed by other ministers to other kinds of men. My spirit never walked beyond our counting house. Mark me! In life, my spirit never ranged beyond the narrow confines of our money-changing hole. And now, weary journeys lie before me. For I never knew that any spirit, working kindly in its little sphere, whatever it may be, will find its mortal life too short for its vast means of usefulness. Never knew that no space of regret can make amends for one life's opportunities misused. Ah, but such was I. Such was I! But you were always a good man of business, Jacob. Business! Mankind was my business. Charity, mercy, forbearance and benevolence were all my business. The dealings of my trade were but a drop of water in the comprehensive ocean of my business. Why did I walk with my eyes downward and never raise them to that star which guided the wise men to a poor abode? Were there no poor homes to which its light would have conducted me? He held up his chain at arm's length, as if that were the cause of all his unavailing grief, and flung it heavily to the ground. Hear me, my time is nearly gone. I will, but don't be hard upon me. Don't be flowery, Jacob, pray. I am here tonight to warn you, that you may have a chance and hope of escaping my fate. A chance and hope of my procuring Ebenezer. Thank you. You were always a good friend to me. You will be haunted by 3 spirits. Is that the chance and hope you mentioned, Jacob? It is. I think I'd rather not. Without their visits, you cannot hope to shun the path I tread. Expect the first tomorrow, when the bell tolls 1. The second, upon the next night, at the same hour. The third, upon the next night, when the last stroke of 12 has ceased to vibrate. Look to see me no more. And look that for your own sake you remember what has passed between us. The apparition walked backward from him, and at every step he took the window raised itself a little, so that when the spectre reached it, it was wide open. He beckoned Scrooge to approach, which he did. When they were within 2 paces of each other, Marley's ghost held up his hand, warning him to come no nearer. Scrooge stopped, not so much in obedience as in surprise and fear. For on the raising of the hand, he became sensible of confused noises in the air. Incoherent sounds of lamentation and regret. Wailings inexpressibly sorrowful and self-accusatory. The spectre, after listening for a moment, joined in the mournful dirge and floated out upon the bleak, dark night. Scrooge followed to the window, desperate in his curiosity. The air was filled with phantoms, wandering hither and thither in restless haste and moaning as they went. Every one of them wore chains like Marley's ghost. Some few, they might be guilty governments, were linked together. None were free. Many had been personally known to Scrooge in their lives. He had been quite familiar with one old ghost in a white waistcoat, with a monstrous iron safe attached to his ankle, who cried piteously at being unable to assist a wretched woman with an infant whom it saw on the streets below. The misery with them all was clearly that they sought to interfere for good in human matters and had lost the power forever. Whether these creatures faded into mist or whether mist enshrouded them, he could not tell. But they and their spirit voices faded together, and the night became as it had been when he walked home. Scrooge closed the window and examined the door by which the ghost had entered. It was double locked, as he himself had locked it with his own hands, and the bolts were undisturbed. He tried to say, "Humbug," but stopped at the first syllable. And being, from the emotion he had undergone, or the fatigues of the day, or his glimpse of the invisible world, or the dull conversation of the ghost, or the lateness of the hour, much in need of repose, he went straight to bed without undressing and fell asleep upon the instant. thought too when I went to bed. It isn't possible. It isn't possible that I can have slept through a whole day and far into another night. It isn't possible that anything has happened to the sun and it is 12 at noon. Scrooge went to bed again and thought. And thought. And thought it over and over and could make nothing of it. The more he thought, the more perplexed he was. And the more he endeavored not to think, the more he thought. Scrooge lay in this state until the chime had gone 3/4 more, when he remembered, on a sudden, that the ghost had warned him of a visitation when the bell tolled 1. He resolved to lie awake until the hour was past. The 1/4 hour was so long that he was more than once convinced he must have sunk into a doze unconsciously and missed the clock. At length, it broke upon his listening ear. 1/4 past. Yes, 1/2 past. 1/4 to it. The hour itself and nothing else. He spoke before the hour bell sounded, however, which it now did with a deep, dull, hollow, melancholy. Yes. 1. Lights flashed up in the room on the instant, and the curtains of his bed were drawn aside. The curtains of his bed were drawn aside, I tell you, by a hand. Not the curtains at his back, nor the curtains at his side, but those to which his face was addressed. The curtains of his bed were drawn aside, and starting up into a half-recumbent attitude, Scrooge found himself face to face with the unearthly visitor who drew them. It was a strange figure, like a child, and yet not so like a child as like an old man, viewed through some supernatural medium, which gave him the appearance of having receded from the view and being diminished to a child's proportions. Its hair, which hung about its neck and down its back, was white as if with age, and yet the face had not a wrinkle in it, and the tenderest bloom was on the skin. Its legs and feet, most delicately formed, were, like its upper members, bare. It wore a tunic of the purest white, and round its waist was bound a lustrous belt, the sheen of which was beautiful. It held a branch of fresh green holly in its hand, and in singular contradiction to that wintry emblem, had its dress trimmed with summer flowers. But the strangest thing about it was that from the crown of its head there sprung a bright, clear jet of light, by which all this was visible, and which was doubtless the occasion of its using in its duller moments a great candle extinguisher for a cap which it now held under its arm. Are you the spirit, sir, whose coming was foretold to me? I am. Who and what are you? I am the ghost of Christmas past. Long past? No, your past. Perhaps Scrooge could not have told anybody why, if anybody could have asked him, but he had a special desire to see the spirit in its cap, and begged him to be covered. What? Would you so soon put out with worldly hands the light I give? Is it not enough that you are one of those whose passions made this cap, and force me through long trains of years to wear it low upon my brow? What business brings you here? Your welfare. I am much obliged, but a night of unbroken rest would have been more conducive to that end. Your reclamation, then. Take heed. It put out its hand and clasped him gently by the arm. Rise and walk with me. It would have been in vain for Scrooge to plead that the weather and the hour were not adapted to pedestrian purposes, that he was clad but lightly in his slippers, dressing gown, and nightcap. The grasp, though gentle as a woman's hand, was not to be resisted. He rose, but finding that the spirit made toward the window, he clasped its robe in supplication. I am mortal and liable to fall. Bear but a touch of my hand there, upon your heart, and you will be upheld in more than this. As the words were spoken, they passed through the wall and stood upon an open country road with fields on either side. The city had completely vanished, not a vestige of it was to be seen. The darkness and the mist had vanished with it, for it was a clear, cold winter day with snow upon the ground. Good heaven! I was bred in this place. I was a boy here. You recollect the way. Remember it. I could walk it blindfold. Strange to have forgotten it for so many years. They walked along the road, Scrooge recognizing every gate and post and tree. And he was conscious of 1,000 odors floating in the air, each one connected with 1,000 thoughts and hopes and joys and cares long, long forgotten. They went on until a little market town appeared in the distance, with its bridge, its church, and winding river. Some shaggy ponies were now seen trotting toward them with boys upon their backs, who called to other boys in country gigs and carts driven by farmers. All these boys were in great spirits and shouted to each other until the broad fields were so full of merry music that the crisp air laughed to hear it. These are but shadows of things that have been, and they have no consciousness of us. The school is not quite deserted. A solitary child, abandoned by his friends, is there still. They left the high road by a well-remembered lane and soon approached a mansion of dull red brick with a little weathercock-surmounted cupola and a bell hanging in it. There was an earthy savour in the air, a chilly bareness in the place, which associated itself somehow with too much getting up by candlelight and not too much to eat. They went, the ghost and Scrooge, across the hall to a door at the back of the schoolhouse. It opened before them and disclosed a long, bare, melancholy room, made barer still by lines of plain deal forms and desks. At one of these, a lonely boy was reading near a feeble fire, and Scrooge sat down and wept to see his poor forgotten self as he had used to be. I wish, but it's too late now. What is the matter? Nothing. Nothing. There was a boy singing a Christmas carol in my door last night. I should like to have given him something. That's all. The ghost smiled thoughtfully and waved its hand. Let us see another Christmas. Scrooge's former self grew larger at the words, and the room became a little darker and more dirty. The panels shrunk, the windows cracked, fragments of plaster fell out of the ceiling, and the naked laths were shown instead. But how all this was brought about, Scrooge had no more idea than you do. He only knew that it was quite correct, that it had happened so, and there he was, alone again, when all the other boys had gone home for the jolly holidays. He was not reading now, but walking up and down despairingly. Scrooge glanced anxiously toward the door. It opened, and a little girl, much younger than the boy, came darting in and put her arms around his neck, crying, "Dear brother, dear brother, I've come to bring you home, home, home." "Home, little Fan," returned the boy. "Yes, home for good and all, home for ever and ever. Father is so much kinder than he used to be, that home's like heaven. He spoke to me so gently one dear night as I was going to bed that I was not afraid to ask him once more if you might come home. And he said, yes, you should. And he sent me in a coach to bring you. And you're to be a man and never to come back here. But first, we're to be together all the Christmas long and have the merriest time in all the world." Then she began to drag him in her childish eagerness toward the door, and he, nothing loath to go, accompanied her. Always a delicate creature, whom a breath might have withered, but she had a large heart. So she had. You're right. I will not gainsay it, Spirit. God forbid. She died a woman and had, as I think, children. True. Your nephew? Yes. At that moment they left the school behind them and were in the busy thoroughfares of a city. It was made plain enough by the dressing of the shops that here too it was Christmas time again, that it was evening and the streets were lighted up. The ghost stopped at a certain warehouse door and asked Scrooge if he knew it. Knew it? I was apprenticed here. They went in and found an old gentleman in a Welsh wig sitting behind such a high desk that if he had been 2 inches taller, he must have brushed his head against the ceiling. Why, it's old Fezziwig! It's old Fezziwig alive again! Old Fezziwig laid down his pen and looks up at the clock, which pointed to the hour of 7. He rubbed his hands, adjusted his capacious waistcoat, and laughed all over himself. Yo-ho there, Ebenezer! Dick! Scrooge's former self, now grown a young man, came briskly in, accompanied by his fellow prentice. Dick Wilkins, to be sure. Bless me, there he is, yes. He was very much attached to me, was Dick. Poor Dick, dear, dear. Yo-ho, my boys, no more work tonight. Christmas Eve, Dick. Christmas, Ebenezer. Let's have the shutters up before a man can say Jack Robinson. You wouldn't have believed how those two fellows went at it. They charged into the street with the shutters. 1, 2, 3. Had them up in their places. 4, 5, 6. Barred them, pinned them. 7, 8, 9. And came back before you could have got to 12, panting like racehorses. Hillo-ho! Fezziwig skipped down from the desk with wonderful agility. Clear away, my lads, and let's have lots of room here. Clear away. There was nothing they wouldn't have cleared away with old Fezziwig looking on. It was done in a minute. The floor was swept and watered. The lamps were trimmed. Fuel was heaped upon the fire. And the warehouse was as snug and warm and dry and bright a ballroom as you would desire to see upon a winter's night. In came a fiddler. An artful dog, mind. The sort of fellow who knows his business better than you or I could tell it to him. The famous Seamus McGlenny of County Kilkenny. Yes, Seamus McGlenny. And there he is, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, honoured to have you, my dear Seamus. Yes. An orchestra in and of himself. He went up to the lofty desk and tuned like 50 stomach aches. In came Mrs. Fezziwig, one vast substantial smile. In came the 3 Miss Fezziwig, beaming and lovable. In came the 6 young followers whose hearts they broke. In came all the young men and women employed in the business. They all came one after another, some shyly, some boldly, some gracefully, some awkwardly, some pushing, some pulling. In they all came, anyhow and everyhow, and away they all went. 20 couples at once. Hands up round, back again the other way, down the middle, up again, round and round, round and round, and round in various stages of affectionate grouping. And then old Fezziwig stood out to dance with Mrs. Fezziwig. Top couple too, with a good stiff piece of work cut out for them. 24 pair of partners. People who were not to be trifled with. People who would dance and had no notion of walking. But if they had been twice as many, 4 times, old Fezziwig would have been a match for them. And so would Mrs. Fezziwig. A positive light appeared to issue from Fezziwig's calves. They shone in every part of the dance like moons. You couldn't have predicted at any given time what would become of the next. And when Mrs. Fezziwig and old Fezziwig had gone all through the dance, advance and retire, both hands to your partner, bow and curtsy, corkscrew through, thread the needle, back again, to your place, Fezziwig, cut so deftly that he appeared to wink with his legs and came up on his feet again without a stagger. And then they served out the hot cider! Yes! Oh, and there they are! Lovely ladies too, serving out the hot cider. Let every heart carry blue, and let them make a scene, and let them make a scene, and let them make a scene. Joy to the world, the Savior reigns. Let men songs employ, while fields and lands, rushes and plains repeat the sounding joy, repeat the sounding joy, repeat the sounding joy. Joy to the world. And an announcement, ladies and gentlemen, while enjoying your hot cider, have some peace. There's for you. This will represent a remarkable opportunity to visit the incomparable water closet here in this marvelous facility. A 10-minute interlude shall occur at this time, and I do mean 10 minutes, as there's a glorious gathering at Mount Washington that we all wish to go to. This enthralling tale will resume in 10 minutes. Bless you all! Apple cider. Here we go. Cider, anyone? Cider here. More cider? More cider? There you go. Will you take this tray? Mr. Dickens has to go backstage. Thank you. When the clock struck 11, this domestic ball broke up. Mr. and Mrs. Fezziwig took their stations, one on either side of the door, and shaking hands with every person individually as he or she went out, wished him or her a Merry Christmas. When everybody had retired, but the two apprentices, they did the same to them, and thus the cheerful voices died away, and the lads were left to their beds, which were under a counter in the back shop. During the whole of this time, Scrooge had acted like a man out of his wits. His heart and soul were in the scene, and with his former self, he remembered everything, corroborated everything, enjoyed everything, and underwent the strangest agitation. It was only now, when the bright faces of his former self and Dick were turned from them, that he remembered the ghost, and became conscious that it was looking full upon him, while the light upon its head burned very clear. A small matter to make these silly folk so full of gratitude. Small? Why, is it not? He has spent but 3 or 4 pounds, perhaps, of your mortal money. It isn't that. It isn't that, Spirit. He has the power to make us happy or unhappy, to render our service light or burdensome, a pleasure or a toil. The pleasure he gives is quite as great as if it cost a fortune. My time grows short. Quick! This was not addressed to Scrooge, or to anyone whom he could see, but it produced an immediate effect. For again Scrooge saw himself. He was older now, a man in the prime of life. His face had not the harsh and rigid lines of later years, but it had begun to wear the signs of care and avarice. There was an eager, greedy, restless motion in the eye that showed the passion that had taken root and where the shadow of the growing tree would fall. He was not alone, but sat by the side of a fair young girl in a mourning dress, in whose eyes there were tears. Another idol has displaced me, and if it can cheer and comfort you in time to come, as I would have tried to do, I have no just cause to grieve. What idol has displaced you? A golden one. This is the even-handed dealing of the world. There is nothing on which it is so hard as poverty. And there is nothing it professes to condemn more severely than the pursuit of wealth. You fear the world too much. I have seen your nobler aspirations fall off one by one until the master passion, gain, engrosses you, have I not? What then? Even if I have grown so much wiser, what then? I have not changed toward you. You are changed. If you were free, today, tomorrow, yesterday, can even I believe that you would choose a dowerless girl? I release you with a full heart for the love of him you once were. She rose and left him. Spirit, remove me from this place. I told you that these are shadows of things that have been, that they are what they are. Do not blame me. Remove me. I cannot bear it. He turned upon the ghost and saw that it looked at him with a face in which, in some strange way, there were fragments of all the faces it had shown him. Leave me. Take me back. Haunt me no longer. Scrooge observed that its light was burning high and bright, and dimly connecting that with its influence over him, he seized the extinguisher cap, and by a sudden action pressed it down upon its head. The spirit dropped beneath it, so that the extinguisher covered its whole form. But though Scrooge pressed it down with all his force, he could not hide the light, which streamed under it in an unbroken flood upon the ground. Scrooge was conscious of being exhausted and overcome by an irresistible drowsiness. He gave the cap a parting squeeze, in which his hand relaxed, and had barely time to reel to bed before he sank into a heavy sleep. Awaking in the middle of a prodigiously tough snore, and sitting up in bed to collect his thoughts, Scrooge had no occasion to be told that the bell was again upon the stroke of one. He felt that he was restored to consciousness in the right nick of time for the especial purpose of holding a conference with the second messenger dispatched to him through old Jacob Marley's intervention. But, finding that he turned uncomfortably cold when he began to wonder which of his bed curtains this new spectre would draw aside, he put them every one aside with his own hands, and established a sharp lookout all around the bed. He was determined to challenge the spirit upon its appearance, and did not wish to be taken by surprise and made nervous. Now, I don't mind calling on you to believe that he was ready for a good broad field of strange appearances, and that nothing between a baby and a rhinoceros would have surprised him very much. Being prepared for almost anything, he was not by any means prepared for nothing. And consequently, when the bell struck one, and no shape appeared, he was taken with a violent fit of trembling. All this time, he lay upon his bed, the very core and center of a blaze of ruddy light, which streamed upon it when the clock proclaimed the hour, and which, being only light, was more alarming than a dozen ghosts, as he was powerless to make out what it was. At last, he began to think that the source and secret of this ghostly light might be in the adjoining room, upon which, on further tracing it, it seemed to shine. This idea, taking full possession of his mind, he got up softly and shuffled in his slippers to the door. "Ebenezer Scrooge! Come in, man!" Scrooge obeyed. It was his own room, there was no doubt about that, but it had undergone an astonishing transformation. The walls and ceiling were so hung with living green that it looked a perfect grove, from which every part bright gleaming berries glistened. The crisp leaves of holly, mistletoe, and ivy reflected back the light, as if so many little mirrors had been scattered there, and such a mighty blaze went roaring up the chimney as that old petrifaction of a hearth had never known in Scrooge's time, or Marley's, or many a long year gone. Heaped up on the floor to form a kind of throne were turkeys, geese, game, poultry, mince pies, plum puddings, luscious pears, red-hot chestnuts, cherry-cheeked apples, and seething bowls of punch that made the chamber dim with their delicious steam. In easy state upon this couch there sat a jolly giant, glorious to see, who bore a glowing torch in shape not unlike Plenty's horn, and held it up, high up, to shed its light on Scrooge as he came peeping round the door. Come in, and know me better, man. I am the ghost of Christmas presents. Look upon me. Scrooge reverently did so. The ghost was clothed in one simple deep green robe or mantle bordered with white fur. This garment hung so loosely on the figure that its capacious breast was bare. Its feet, observable beneath the ample folds of the garment, were also bare, and on its head it wore no other covering than a holly wreath, set here and there with shining icicles. Its dark brown curls were long and free as its genial face, its sparkling eye, its open hand, its unconstrained demeanor, and its joyful air. Girded round its middle was an antique scabbard, but no sword was in it, and the ancient sheath was eaten up with rust. You have never seen the like of me before. Never. Have never walked forth with the younger members of my family, meaning, for I am very young, my elder brothers, born in these later years. I don't think I have. I'm afraid I have not. Have you had many brothers, Spirit? More than 1,800. A tremendous family to provide for. The ghost of Christmas present rose. Touch my robe! Scrooge did as he was told and held it fast. The room, the fire, the ruddy glow, the throne of plenty, and the hour of the night all vanished instantly, and they stood upon the streets on Christmas morning. The sky was gloomy, and the shortest streets were choked up with a dingy mist, half thawed, half frozen, whose heavier particles descended in a shower of sooty atoms, as if every chimney in Great Britain had simultaneously caught fire and were blazing away to their dear hearts' content. There was nothing very cheerful in the climate or the town, and yet there was an air of cheerfulness abroad. Scrooge and the ghost of Christmas present moved on, invisible, through the town, into the suburbs, and straight to Scrooge's clerk's house. There, Mrs. Cratchit, Bob Cratchit's wife, dressed out but poorly in a twice-turned gown, but brave in ribbons, which are cheap and make a goodly show for sixpence, laid out the tablecloth, assisted by Belinda Cratchit, second of her daughters, also brave in ribbons, while Master Peter Cratchit plunged a fork into the saucepan of potatoes, and getting the corners of his monstrous shirt collar, Bob's private property conferred upon his heir in honor of the day, into his mouth. And the two smaller Cratchits, boy and girl, came tearing in, screaming that outside the baker's they had smelled the goose and known it for their own. And basking in luxurious thoughts of sage and onion, these young Cratchits danced about the table and exalted Master Peter Cratchit to the skies, while he, not proud, although his collars nearly choked him, blew the fire until the slow potatoes, bubbling up, knocked loudly at the saucepan lid to be let out and peeled. What has ever got your precious father, then, and your brother Tiny Tim? And Martha was late last Christmas Eve by half an hour. "Here's Martha, mother," cried the two young Cratchits. "Hurrah! There's such a goose, Martha!" "Why, bless your heart alive, my dear, how late you are," said Mrs. Cratchit, kissing her a dozen times and taking off her shawl and bonnet for her with officious zeal. "Well, never mind so long as you're come. Sit ye down before the fire, my dear, and have a warm, Lord bless ye." "No, no, no, there's father coming," cried the two younger Cratchits, who were everywhere at once. "Hide, Martha, hide!" So Martha hid herself, and in came little Bob, the father, with at least 3 feet of comforter, exclusive of the fringe, hanging down before him, and his threadbare clothes darned up and brushed to look seasonable, and Tiny Tim upon his shoulder. Alas for Tim, he bore a little crutch, and had his limbs supported by an iron frame. "Why, where's our Martha?" cried Bob, looking round. "Not coming. Not coming? Not coming on Christmas Day?" Martha didn't like to see him disappointed, if it were only for a joke, so she came out prematurely from behind the closet door and ran into his arms, while the two younger Cratchits hustled Tiny Tim and bore him off into the wash-house that he might hear the pudding singing in the copper. "And how did little Tim behave?" asked Mrs. Cratchit, after Bob had hugged his daughter to his heart's content. "As good as gold, and better. Somehow he gets thoughtful, sitting by himself so much, and he thinks the strangest things you ever heard. He told me, coming home, that he hoped the people saw him in the church because he was a cripple, and it might be pleasant for them to remember on Christmas Day who made lame beggars walk and blind men see. He's growing strong and hearty." Tim's active little crutch was heard upon the floor, and back came Tiny Tim before another word was spoken, escorted by his brother and sister to his stool before the fire, while Bob, turning up his cuffs as if, poor fellow, they were capable of being made more shabby, compounded some hot mixture in a jug with gin and lemons, and stirred it round and put it on the hob to simmer. Master Peter and the two ubiquitous younger Cratchits went to fetch the goose, with which they soon returned in high procession. Such a bustle ensued that you might have thought a goose the rarest of all birds, a feathered phenomenon, to which a black swan was a matter of course. And in truth, it was something very like it in that house. Mrs. Cratchit made the gravy ready beforehand in a little saucepan, hissing hot. Master Peter mashed the potatoes with incredible vigour. Miss Belinda sweetened up the applesauce. Martha dusted the hot plates. Bob took Tiny Tim beside him in a corner at the table. The two young Cratchits set chairs for everybody, not forgetting themselves, and mounting guard upon the goose, they crammed spoons into their mouths, lest they should shriek for goose before their turn came to be helped. At last the dishes were set on, and grace was said. For what we are about to receive, may the Lord make us truly thankful. Amen. This was succeeded by a breathless pause, as Mrs. Cratchit, looking slowly all along the carving knife, prepared to plunge it in the goose. But when she did, and when the long-expected gush of stuffing issued forth, one murmur of delight rose all round the table, and even Tiny Tim, excited by the two younger Cratchits, beat upon the table with the handle of his knife and feebly cried, "Hurrah!" There never was such a goose. Bob said that he didn't believe there ever was such a goose cooked. Its tenderness and flavour, size and cheapness were the themes of universal admiration. Eked out by applesauce and mashed potatoes, it was a sufficient dinner for the whole family. Indeed, as Mrs. Cratchit said with great delight, surveying one small atom of a bone left upon the dish, "We haven't ate it all at last." Yet everyone had enough, and the youngest Cratchits in particular were steeped in sage and onion to the eyebrows. At last, the dinner was all done, the cloth was cleared, the hearth swept, the fire made up, the compound in the jug being tasted and considered perfect. Apples and oranges were put upon the table, and a shovelful of chestnuts on the fire. Then, all the Cratchit family drew round in what Bob called a circle, meaning half a one, and at Bob Cratchit's elbow stood the family display of glass, 2 tumblers and a custard cup without a handle. These held the hot stuff from the jug, however, as well as golden goblets would have done, and Bob served it out with beaming looks while the chestnuts on the fire crackled noisily. Then Bob proposed. A Merry Christmas to us all, my dears. God bless us. God bless us, everyone, said Tiny Tim, the last of all. He sat very close to his father's side, upon his little stool, and Bob held his withered hand in his. Spirit, tell me if Tiny Tim will live. I see a vacant seat in the poor chimney corner, and a crutch without an owner carefully preserved. If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, the child will die. No, Spirit, no. What then? If he be like to die, he had better do it, and decrease the surplus population. Man, if man you be not adamant, forbear that wicked cant, until you have discovered what the surplus is, and where it is. Will you decide what men shall live, and what shall die? It may be that in the sight of heaven, you are more worthless and less fit to live than millions like this poor man's child. Scrooge bent his head before the ghost's rebuke and cast his eyes upon the ground. But he raised them speedily on hearing his own name. Mr. Scrooge, I give you Mr. Scrooge, the founder of the feast. Founder of the feast indeed. I wish I had him here. I'd give him a piece of my mind to feast upon, and I hope he'd have a good appetite for it. My dear, the children. Christmas Day. It should be Christmas Day, I'm sure, on which one drinks to the health of such an odious, hard, unfeeling, stingy man as Mr. Scrooge is. You know he is, Robert. Nobody knows it better than you, my poor fellow. My dear, Christmas Day. I'll drink his health for your sake, and for the day's, not for his. Long life to him. Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. He'll be very merry and very happy, I have no doubt. The children drank the toast after her. It was the first of their proceedings which had no trace of heartiness in it. Tiny Tim drank it last of all, but he didn't care twopence for it. Scrooge was the ogre of the family. The mention of his name cast a dark shadow on the party, which was not dispelled for full 5 minutes. After it had passed, they were 10 times merrier than before, for the relief of Scrooge the baleful being done with. All this time, the chestnuts in the jug went round and round, and by they had a song from Tiny Tim about the holly and the ivy. He had a plaintive little voice, and sang it very well. The holly and the ivy, when they are both full grown, of all the leaves that are in the wood, the holly bears a crown. The holly bears a thistle, as sharp as any thorn, and Mary bore sweet Jesus Christ on Christmas Day in the morn. There was nothing of very high mark in all this. They were not a handsome family. They were not well dressed. Their shoes were far from being waterproof, and their clothes were scanty. But they were happy, grateful, pleased with one another, and contented with the time. And when they faded, and looked happier yet in the bright sprinklings of the Spirit's torch at parting, Scrooge had his eye upon them, and especially on Tiny Tim, until the last. By this time it was getting dark, and snowing heavily. And as Scrooge and the Spirit went along the streets, the brightness of the roaring fires in kitchens, parlours, and all sorts of rooms was wonderful. Blessings on it, how the ghost exulted! How it bared its breadth of breast, and opened its capacious palm, and floated on, outpouring with a generous hand its bright and harmless mirth on all within its reach. And now, without a word of warning from the ghost, they stood upon a bleak and desert moor. What place is this, Spirit? A place where miners live, who labor in the bowels of the earth, but they know me. See! A light shone from the window of a hut, and swiftly they advanced toward it. Passing through the wall of mud and stone, they found a cheerful company assembled round a fire. An old man and woman with their children, and their children's children, and another generation beyond that, all decked out gaily in their holiday attire, sang together a Christmas song, loud and blithe above the howling of the wind upon the barren waste. The Spirit did not tarry here, but bade Scrooge hold his robe, and passing on above the moor, sped beyond it to the sea, built upon a dismal reef of sunken rocks, some leagues or so from shore, on which the waters chafed and dashed the wild year through. There stood a solitary lighthouse. But even here, two men who watched the light had made a fire that through the loophole in the thick stone wall shed out a ray of brightness over the awful scene. Joining their horny hands over the rough table at which they sat, they wished each other Merry Christmas in their can of grog. Again the ghost sped on above the black and heaving sea, on, until being far away from any shore, they lighted on a ship. They stood beside the helmsman at the wheel, the lookout in the bow, the officers who had the watch, dark, ghostly figures in their several stations, but every man among them hummed a Christmas tune, or had a Christmas thought, or spoke below his breath to his companion of some bygone Christmas day with homeward hopes belonging to it. It was a great surprise to Scrooge to suddenly hear a hearty laugh. It was a much greater surprise to recognize it as his own nephew's, and to find himself in a bright, dry, gleaming parlor, and to see that same nephew with the Spirit standing smiling by his side with approving affability. He said that Christmas was a humbug as I live, and he meant it too. More shame for him, Fred, said Scrooge's niece indignantly. He's a comical old fellow, that's the truth, and not so pleasant as he might be. However, his offences carry their own punishment, and I have nothing to say against him. I'm sure he's very rich, Fred. At least you always tell me so. What of that, my dear? His wealth is of no use to him. He doesn't do any good with it. He doesn't make himself comfortable with it. He hasn't the satisfaction of thinking that he's ever going to benefit us with it. I have no patience with him. Oh, I have. I'm sorry for him. I couldn't be angry with him if I tried. Who suffers by his ill whims? Himself, always. Here he takes it into his head to dislike us, and he won't come and dine with us. Now, what's the consequence? He loses some pleasant moments which could do him no harm. I'm sure he loses pleasanter companions than he can find in his own thoughts, either in his mouldy old office or his dusty chambers. I mean to give him the same chance every year, whether he likes it or not, for I pity him. And I think I shook him yesterday. It was their turn to laugh now at the notion of his shaking Scrooge. But being thoroughly good-natured, and not much caring what they laughed at, so long as they laughed at any rate, he encouraged them in their merriment and passed the bottle joyously. But the whole scene passed off in a breath, And Scrooge and the spirit were on their travels again. Much they saw, and far they went. Many homes they visited, but always with a happy end. The spirit stood by sick beds, and they were cheerful. On foreign lands, and they were close at home. By struggling men, and they were patient in their greater hope. By poverty, and it was rich. In almshouse, hospital, and jail. In misery's every refuge, where vain man in his brief little authority had not made fast the door and barred the spirit out, he left his blessings and taught Scrooge his precepts. It was a long night, if it were only a night. But Scrooge had his doubts of this, because the Christmas holidays appeared to be condensed into the space of time they spent together. It was strange, too, that while Scrooge remained unaltered in his outward form, the ghost grew older, clearly older. Scrooge had observed this change, but never spoke of it until they left a children's 12th night party. When looking at the spirit as they stood together in an open place, he noticed that its hair was grey. Our spirits' lives so short. My life upon this globe is very brief. It ends tonight at midnight. Hark, the time is drawing near. Forgive me if I am not justified in what I ask, spirit, but I see something strange and not belonging to yourself protruding from the hem of your skirts. Is it a foot or a claw? It might be a claw, for all the flesh there is upon it. Look here. From the foldings of its robe, the spirit brought 2 children, wretched, abject, frightful, hideous, miserable. They knelt down at his feet and clung upon the outside of its garment. Oh man, look down here. Look here. They were a boy and girl, yellow, meager, ragged, scowling, wolvish, but prostrate too in their humility. Where graceful youth should have filled their features out and touched them with its freshest tints, a stale and shriveled hand like that of age had pinched and twisted them and pulled them into shreds. Where angels might have sat enthroned, devils lurked and glared out menacingly. No change, no degradation, no perversion of humanity in any grade through all the wonderful mysteries of creation has monsters half so horrible and dread. Scrooge started back, appalled. Spirit, are they yours? They are man's, and they cling to me, appealing from their fathers. This boy is ignorance. This girl is want. Beware of them both, and all of their degree, but most of all beware this boy. For on his brow I see that written which is doom, unless the writing be erased. Deny it! Slander those who tell it ye! Admit it for your factious purposes, and make it worse, and bide the end. Have they no refuge? No resource? Are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses? The bell struck 12. Scrooge looked about him for the ghost, and saw it not. As the last stroke ceased to vibrate, he remembered the prediction of old Jacob Marley, and lifting up his eyes, he beheld a solemn phantom, draped and hooded, coming like a mist along the ground toward him. Slowly, gravely, silently the phantom approached. Scrooge bent down upon his knee, for in the very air through which this spirit moved, it seemed to scatter gloom and mystery. It was shrouded in a deep black garment, which concealed its head, its face, its form, and left nothing of it visible save an outstretched hand. But for this, it would have been difficult to detach its figure from the night, and separate it from the darkness by which it was surrounded. Its mysterious presence filled Scrooge with a solemn dread. I am in the ghost of the Christmas yet to come. The spirit answered not, but pointed onward with its hand. You are about to show me the shadows of things that have not happened, but will happen in the time before us. Is that so, Spirit? The upper portion of the garment was contracted for an instant in its folds, as if the Spirit had inclined its head. That was the only answer he received. But Scrooge was all the worse for this. It thrilled him with a vague, uncertain horror to know that behind the dusky shroud there were ghostly eyes intently fixed upon him. Ghost of the future, I fear you more than any spectre I have seen. Lead on! Lead on! The night is waning fast, and it is precious time to me, I know, Spirit. Lead on! They scarcely seemed to enter the city, and suddenly there they were in the heart of it, among the merchants who hurried up and down, checking the money in their pockets, conversing in groups and looking at their watches and so forth, as Scrooge had seen them often. The Spirit stopped beside one little knot of businessmen. Observing that the hand was pointed to them, Scrooge advanced to listen to their talk.
No, I don't know much about it either way. I only know he's dead.
When did he die?
Last night, I believe.
Why, what was the matter with him? I thought he'd never die.
God knows.
What has he done with his money?
Well, I haven't heard. Left it to his company, perhaps. He hasn't left it to me. That's all I know.
Likely to be a very cheap funeral, for upon my life I don't know anybody to go to it. Suppose we make up a party and volunteer.
I don't mind going, if a lunch is provided. I must be fed if I make one. Goodbye.
Goodbye. Speakers and listeners strolled away and mixed with other groups. Scrooge knew the men and looked toward the Spirit for an explanation. The phantom glided on into a street, its finger pointed to two persons meeting. How are you? How are you? Well, Old Scratch has got his own at last, eh? So they say. Cold, isn't it? Yes. Seasonable for Christmas time. Good day. Good day to you. Not another word. That was their meeting, their conversation, and their parting. Scrooge was at first inclined to be surprised that the Spirit should attach importance to conversations apparently so trivial, but feeling assured that they must have some hidden purpose, he set himself to consider what it was likely to be. He looked in that very place for his own image, but another man stood in his accustomed corner, and though the clock pointed to his usual time of day for being there, he saw no likeness of himself among the multitudes that poured in through the porch. But now they left the busy scene, and they went into an obscure part of the town, where Scrooge had never penetrated before, although he recognized its situation and its foul repute. The ways were foul and narrow, the shops and houses wretched, the people half-naked, drunken, slipshod, ugly. Alleys and archways, like so many cesspools, disgorged their offences of smell and dirt and life upon the straggling streets, and the whole quarter reeked with crime, with filth and misery. Far in this den of infamous resort there was a low-browed, beetling shop below a penthouse roof, where iron, old rags, bottles, bones, and greasy offal were bought. Upon the floor within were piled up rusty keys, nails, chains, files, scales, weights, refuse, iron of all kinds. Sitting in among the wares he dealt in, by a charcoal stove made of old bricks, sat a grey-haired rascal, nearly 70 years of age. Scrooge and the Phantom came into the presence of this man, just as a woman with a heavy bundle slunk into the shop. But she had scarcely entered when another woman similarly laden came in too, and she was followed by a man in faded black, who was no less startled by the sight of them than they had been upon the recognition of each other. "Let the charwoman alone to be the first," cried she who'd entered first. "Let the laundress alone to be the second. Let the undertaker's man alone to be the third. Look here, old Joe, here's a chance. If we haven't all three met here without meaning it." "You couldn't have met in a better place. Come into the parlour. Come in, into the parlour. The parlour was the space behind a screen of rags. The woman, who had already spoken, threw a bundle on the floor and sat down in a flaunting manner on a stool, crossing her elbows on her knees and looking with a bold defiance at the other two. What odds, then? What odds, Mrs. Dilber? Every person has a right to take care of themselves. He always did. Who's to be the worse for the loss of a few things like these, eh? Not a dead man, I suppose. Huh? If he wanted to keep him after he was dead, why wasn't he natural in his lifetime? If he had been, he'd have had somebody to look after him when he was struck with death, instead of lying, gasping out his last there alone by himself. The man in faded black mounting the breech first produced his plunder. It was not extensive. A seal or two, a pencil case, a pair of sleeve buttons and a brooch of no great value were all. They were severally examined by old Joe, who chalked up the sums he was disposed to give for each upon the wall and added them up into a total when he found there was nothing more to come. Mrs. Dilber, what's next? Sheets and towels. A little wearing apparel, 2 old-fashioned silver teaspoons, a pair of sugar tongs, and a few boots. Her account was stated on the wall in a similar manner. And now undo my bundle, Joe, said the first woman. Joe went down upon his knees for the greater convenience of opening it, and having unfastened a great many knots, pulled out a large heavy roll of some dark stuff. What do you call this? Bed curtains? You don't mean to say you took 'em down, rings and all, with him lying there? Yes, I do. Why not? Here, don't drop that oil upon his blankets now. His blankets? Whose else's do you think? He isn't likely to take cold without 'em, I dare say. Not where he's going. I hope he didn't die of anything catching, eh? Don't be afraid of that. I ain't so fond of his company that I'd loiter about him for such things if he did. You may look through that shirt until your eyes ache, but you won't find an hole in it, nor a threadbare place. It's the best he had, and a fine one too. They'd have wasted it if it weren't for me. What do you call the wasting of it? Why, putting it on him to be buried in, to be sure. Somebody was fool enough to do it, but I took it off again. Scrooge listened to this dialogue in horror. As they sat grouped about their spoil and the scanty light afforded by the old man's lamp, he viewed them with a detestation and disgust which could hardly have been greater if they had been obscene demons marketing the corpse itself. Spirit, I see the case of this unhappy man might be my own. My life tends that way now. Merciful heaven! What is this? He recoiled in terror, for the scene had changed, and now he almost touched a bed. A bare, uncurtained bed, on which, beneath a ragged sheet, there lay something covered up. Though it was dumb, it announced itself in awful language. The room was very dark. Too dark to be observed with any accuracy, though Scrooge, in obedience to a secret impulse, glanced about, anxious to know what kind of room it was. A pale light, rising in the outer air, fell straight upon the bed, and on it, plundered and bereft, unwatched, unwept, uncared for, was the body of a man. Scrooge glanced toward the phantom. Its steady hand was pointed to the head. The cover was so carelessly adjusted that the slightest raising of it, the motion of a finger upon Scrooge's part, would have disclosed the face. He thought of it, how easy it would be to do, and longed to do it, but had no more power to withdraw the veil than to dismiss the spectre at his side. The body lay in the dark, empty house, with not a man, a woman, or a child to say, "He was kind to me, and for the memory of one kind word, I will be kind to him." A cat was tearing at the door, and there was a sound of gnawing rats beneath the hearthstone. What they wanted in the room of death, and why they were so restless, Scrooge did not dare to think. Spirit, this is a fearful place. In leaving it, I shall not leave its lesson. Trust me. Let us go. Still the ghost pointed with unmoved finger to the head. I understand you, Spirit, and I would do it if I could, but I have not the power, Spirit. I have not the power. Again it seemed to look upon him. If there is any person in the town who feels emotion caused by this man's death, show that person to me, Spirit, I beseech you. The phantom spread its dark robe before him for a moment like a wing, and withdrawing it, revealed a room by daylight, where a mother and her children were. She was expecting someone, and with anxious eagerness. At length, the long-expected knock was heard, and she hurried to the door and met her husband, a man whose face was careworn and depressed, though he was young. There was a remarkable expression in it now, a kind of serious delight, of which he was ashamed, and which he struggled to suppress. Is it good or bad? Bad. We are quite ruined then? No. No, there's hope yet, Caroline. If he relents, there is. Nothing is past hope if such a miracle has occurred. He is past relenting. He's dead. She was a mild and patient creature, if her face spoke truth, but she was thankful in her soul to hear it, and said so, with clasped hands. Oh, she prayed forgiveness in the next moment, but the first was the emotion of her heart. To whom will our debt be transferred? I don't know. But before that time we shall be ready with the money. And even though we were not, it would be bad fortune indeed to find so merciless a creditor in his successor. We may sleep tonight with light hearts, Caroline. Yes. Soften it as they would, their hearts were lighter, and it was a happier house for this man's death. The only emotion that the ghost could show him, caused by the event, was one of pleasure. Let me see some tenderness connected with the death, or that dark chamber spirit which we left will be forever present to me. The ghost conducted him through several streets, familiar to his feet, and they entered poor Bob Cratchit's house, and found the mother and children seated round the fire. Quiet. Very quiet. The noisy little Cratchits were still as statues in one corner, and sat looking up at Peter, who had a book before him. The mother and her daughters were engaged in sewing, but surely they were very quiet. Oh, the colour hurts my eyes. It makes them weak by candlelight, and I wouldn't show weak eyes to your father when he comes home for the world. It must be near his time. Past it, rather. But I think he has walked a little slower than he used these last few evenings. I've known him walk with Tiny Tim upon his shoulder very fast indeed. And so have I, said Peter. But he was very light to carry, and his father loved him so that it was no trouble. No trouble. And there's your father at the door. Bob's tea was ready for him on the hob, and they all tried who should help him to it most. And the two young Cratchits got upon his knees and laid each child a little cheek against his face, as if they said, "Don't mind it, father. Don't be grieved." Bob was very cheerful with them and spoke pleasantly to all the family. And then Mrs. Cratchit said, "You went then today, Robert?" "Yes, my dear, I wish you could have gone. It would have done you good to see how green a place it is. But you'll see it often. I promised him that I would walk there on a Sunday." My little child. My little child. He couldn't help it. If he could have helped it, he and his child would have been farther apart, perhaps, than they were. He left them and went upstairs into the room above, which was lighted cheerfully and hung with Christmas. There was a chair set close beside the body of the child. and there were signs of someone having been there lately, Bob sat down, and when he had thought a little and composed himself, he kissed the child's face. He was reconciled to what had happened and went downstairs again at peace. They drew about the fire and talked. Bob told them of the extraordinary kindness of Mr. Scrooge's nephew, whom he'd scarcely seen but once, and how meeting me in the street today and seeing that I looked, just a little down, he asked me what was the matter. On which, for he is the pleasantest spoken gentleman you ever heard, I told him, I'm heartily sorry for it, Mr. Cratchit, he said, and heartily sorry for your good wife. But however, and whenever we part from one another, I'm sure we shall none of us forget Tiny Tim, shall we? Or this first parting that there was among us? Never, Father. And I know, my dears, that when we recollect how patient and how mild he was, though he was just a little child, we shall not quarrel easily among ourselves and forget poor Tiny Tim in doing it, shall we? No, never, Father. I am very happy. I am very happy. The family gathered round and they held each other close. Ah, spirit of Tiny Tim, thy childish essence was from God. Spirit, something informs me that our parting moment is at hand. I know it, but I know not how. Tell me what man that was whom we saw lying dead. The ghost of Christmas yet to come conveyed Scrooge through the darkening streets to an iron gate, a churchyard. Here then the wretched man, whose name he had now to learn, lay underneath the ground. It was a worthy place, walled in by houses, overrun by grass and weeds, the growth of vegetation's death, not life, choked up with too much burying, fat with repleted appetite, a worthy place. The spirit stood among the graves and pointed down to one. Scrooge advanced toward it, trembling. The phantom was exactly as it had been, but Scrooge dreaded that he saw new meaning in its solemn shape. Before I draw nearer to that stone to which you point, answer me one question. Are these the shadows of things that will be, or are they shadows of things that may be only? Still the ghost pointed downward to the grave by which it stood. Men's actions will foreshadow certain ends, to which if persevered in they must lead, but if the courses be departed from, the ends will change. Oh, say it is so with what you show me. The spirit was immovable as ever. Scrooge crept toward it, trembling as he went, and following the finger, read upon the stone of the neglected grave his own name, Ebenezer Scrooge. Am I that man who lay upon the bed? He cried upon his knees. The finger pointed from the grave to him and back again. No, spirit, no, no. The finger still was there. Spirit, hear me. I am not the man I was. I will not be the man I must have been but for your visit. Why show me this if I am past all hope? For the first time the hand appeared to shake. Spirit, your nature intercedes for me and pities me. Assure me that I yet may change these shadows you have shown me by an altered life. The kind hand trembled. I will honor Christmas in my heart. I will strive to keep it all the year. The spirits of all three, past, present, and future, shall strive within me. I will not shut out the lessons that they teach. Oh, tell me that I may sponge away the writing on this stone. In his agony he caught the spectral hand. It sought to free itself, but he was strong in his entreaty and detained it. The spirit, stronger yet, repulsed him. Holding up his hands in a last prayer to have his fate reversed, Scrooge saw an alteration in the phantom's hood and cloak. It shrunk, collapsed, and dwindled down to a bedpost. Yes. And the bedpost was his own. The bed was his own. The room was his own. Best and happiest of all, the time before him was his own to make amends in. I will live in the past, the present, and the future. The spirits of all three shall strive within me. Oh, Jacob Marley! Heaven and the Christmas time be praised for this. I say it on my knees, old Jacob, on my knees. He was so flustered and so glowing with his good intentions that his broken voice would scarcely answer to his call. He had been sobbing violently in his conflict with the spirit, and his face was wet with tears. They are not torn down, said Scrooge, folding one of his bed curtains in his arms. Oh, they're not torn down, rings and all. They are here. I am here. The shadows of the things that might have been will be dispelled. They will be. I know they will. His hands were busy with his garments all this time, turning them on inside out, putting them on upside down, tearing them, mislaying them, making them parties to every kind of extravagance. I don't know what to do. I am as light as a feather. I'm as happy as an angel. I'm as merry as a schoolboy. I'm as giddy as a drunken man. A Merry Christmas to everybody. A Happy New Year to all the world. Hello. He had frisked into the sitting room, and he was now standing there, perfectly winded. There's the saucepan that the gruel was in. Yes. And there's the door by which the ghost of Jacob Marley entered. And there's the corner where the ghost of Christmas present sat. Yes. And there's the window where I saw the wandering spirits. It's all true. It all happened. It's all true. Really, for a man who'd been out of practice for so many years, it was a splendid laugh. A most illustrious laugh. The father of a long, long line of brilliant laughs. I don't know what day of the month it is. I don't know how long I've been among the spirits. I don't know anything. I'm quite a baby. I don't care. I'd rather be a baby. Running to the window, he opened it and put out his head. No fog, no mist, bright, jovial, stirring, cold, piping for the blood to dance to, glorious sunlight, heavenly sky, sweet, fresh air, merry bells, oh, glorious, glorious. What's today? Cried Scrooge, calling downward to a boy in Sunday clothes who'd loitered in to look about him. Eh? What's today, my fine fellow? Today? Why, it's Christmas Day. It's Christmas Day. I haven't missed it. The spirits have done it all in one night. They can do anything they like. Of course they can. Of course they can. Hello, my fine fellow. Hello. Do you know the poulterers in the next street but one at the corner? I should hope I did. An intelligent boy, a remarkable boy. Do you know whether they've sold the prize turkey that was hanging there? Not the little prize turkey, but the big one. Well, the one as big as me. A remarkable boy. It's a pleasure to talk to him. Yes, my buck. Well, it's hanging there now. It is. Then go and buy it. You're joking. No, I'm in earnest. Go and buy it and tell them to bring it here, that I may give them directions where to send it. Come back with the man, and I'll give you a shilling. Come back with him in less than 5 minutes, and I'll give you half a crown. The boy was off like a shot. I'll send it to Bob Cratchit's. He shan't know who sends it. It's twice the size of Tiny Tim. It was a turkey. He never could have stood upon his legs, that bird. He would have snapped them off short in a minute like sticks of sealing wax. Why, it's impossible to carry that to Camden Town. You must have a cab. the chuckle with which he said this, and the chuckle with which he paid for the turkey, and the chuckle with which he paid for the cab, and the chuckle with which he recompensed the boy were only to be exceeded by the chuckle with which he sat down breathless in his chair and chuckled till he cried. Shaving was not an easy task, for his hand continued to shake very much, and shaving requires attention, even if you don't dance while you do it. But if he had cut off the end of his nose, he would have put a piece of sticking plaster over it and been quite satisfied. The people were by this time pouring forth, as he had seen them with the ghost of Christmas present, dressed himself all in his best, and walking with his hands behind him. Scrooge regarded everyone with a delighted smile. He looked so irresistibly pleasant, in a word, that 3 or 4 good-humoured fellows said, "Good morning, sir. A Merry Christmas to you." And Scrooge said often afterward that of all the blithe sounds he had ever heard, those were the blithest in his ears. He went to church and walked about the streets, and he watched the people hurrying to and fro, and he patted children on the head and questioned beggars and looked down into the kitchens of the houses and up into the windows, and he found that everything could yield him pleasure. He had never dreamed that any walk, that anything could give him so much happiness. Oh, but he was early at the office next morning. He was early there. If he could only get there first and catch Bob Cratchit coming in late. That was the thing he had set his heart upon, and he did it. The clock struck 9. No Bob. 1:15. No Bob. He was full 18 minutes and a half behind his time. Scrooge sat with his door wide open, that he might see Bob come into the tank. Bob's hat was off before he opened the door. His comforter too. He was on his stool in a jiffy, driving away with his pen as if he were trying to overtake 9 o'clock. "Hello? What do you mean by coming here this time of day?" "I'm very sorry, sir. I am behind my time." "You are? Yes, I think you are. Step this way, sir, if you please." It's only once a year, sir. It shall not be repeated. I was making rather merry yesterday, sir." "Now, I'll tell you what, my friend. I am not going to stand for this sort of thing any longer. And therefore," he continued, giving Bob such a dig in the waistcoat that he staggered back into the tank again, "therefore, I am about to raise your salary." Bob trembled, and he got a little nearer to the ruler. He had a momentary idea of knocking Scrooge down with it, holding him, and calling to the people in the court for help with a straitjacket. "A Merry Christmas, Bob!" with an earnestness that could not be mistaken as he clapped him on the back. "A merrier Christmas, Bob, my good fellow, than I have given you for many a year. I'll raise your salary and endeavor to assist your struggling family. And you and I will discuss your affairs this very afternoon over a Christmas bowl of smoking Bishop, Bob. Strike up the fires and buy another coal scuttle before you dot another I, Bob Cratchit." Scrooge was better than his word. He did it all, and infinitely more. And to Tiny Tim, who did not die, he was a second father. He became as good a friend, as good a master, as good a man as the good old city ever knew, or any other good old city, town or borough in the good old world. Some people laughed to see the change in him, but he let them laugh and little heeded them, for he was wise enough to know nothing ever happened on this old globe for good, at which some people did not have their fill of laughter at the outset. Knowing that such as these would be blind anyway, he let them laugh, thought it quite as well that they should wrinkle up their eyes in grins as have the malady of less attractive forms. His own heart laughed, and that was enough for him. He had no further visits with spirits, but lived upon the total abstinence principle ever afterward. And it was always said of him that he knew how to keep Christmas well. If any man alive possess the knowledge. May that truly be said of us and all of us. And so, as Tiny Tim observed, say it with me, won't you? God bless us, everyone! Merry Christmas! Merry Christmas! God bless you! God bless you! God bless you! God bless you! Merry Christmas!
Merry Christmas. Terry Glennie. He's here to go. Terry Glennie. Yes. Davis. We were on. Yes. Jackson Moeller. Yes. Paramahansa Yogananda. Oh, yes. And Greg Hassan. Where's brother? I don't know. Is brother here? Not here? Brother? Brother? Is brother here? Yeah. Brother, are you coming? Oh, there he is. Is he here? Oh, there he is. Here he is.
Thanks very much. Now let us get back to our souls. Let us all pray, as we usually do, to conclude our entertainment. Let us close our eyes. Let us feel the divine presence